My first series of questions have to do with persons with disabilities, and I'm looking at page 6, beginning with line 22 to page 7, line 18. And this part of the bill requires voters with disabilities application for mail-in ballot to provide written documentation providing they have a disability. So my first question is, if this bill would require them to do so, to submit a doctor's certificate with an application to vote by mail, do other persons entitled to vote by mail need to submit a statement from a third party affirming their eligibility?
No, ma'am.
No? Thank you. Would the state's resources provide financial assistance to persons with disabilities who are uninsured or whose insurance company charges a copay to visit the doctor to request a certificate? Would you know that?
I don't know if anywhere in the state there are funds for that, but we don't have it in our office.
If this provision creates out-of-pocket expenses for voters with disabilities, could that constitute a poll tax?
I don't know. It's a
Thank you.
question for a court.
If a person with a disability or an illness receives a certificate from a specialist, such as a psychiatrist or an oncologist, that identifies their disease or condition, what protections would be in place for their medical privacy? Would you know that?
Well, as I read this affidavit, it's more generic. It just says that they have a sickness or physical condition.
Do you think those provisions would ensure that the required certificate does not violate the privacy protections provided by HIPAA?
I'm not aware or familiar with the requirements of HIPAA.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the signature match, that begins on page 10, lines 11 to 12, to lines 26 and pages 11, line 1. The bill would allow signature verification committees and early voting ballot boards to examine any known signature of the voter to determine whether he or she signed the mail-in ballot application and mail-in ballot carrier envelope. What is the definition of known signature in the election code?
There's not a definition for known signature, and it's changing what current law is, that they can look at other signatures on file with the county from the previous 6 years, and so this is just broadening that to say any signature on file.
So that would be your interpretation of the term known signature. Any other interpretation of it?
No, I mean, you could conceivably say that a known signature is what the voter signed with whenever they registered to vote.
Thank you. What training do signature verification and early voting ballot board members receive regarding handwriting identification?
We have, they don't receive any specific training with regard to handwriting. They do receive instruction that the standard by which they should judge signatures is if they could have been made by the same person.
Thank you. If they don't have that kind of expertise or training, how can they account for changes in a person's signature, either over time or because of a medical condition? For example, a person who has a stroke. That person's handwriting might change drastically within a matter of days, but that person also might recover and be able to sign and to vote. How would that signature be verified?
So the signature verification requirements are in current law. This is not changing those requirements in any way.
It's just current law. Thank you. Regarding curbside voting, on page 16, lines 20 to 23, and 16, lines 26 to 17, line 11 on page 17. Would requiring the driver of a vehicle in which someone is voting curbside to fill out a form discourage taxi or ride-sharing service drivers from taking persons with disabilities to the polls?
This would require that form to be filled out if the person assists 3 or more voters by taking them to the polls for curbside voting.
The wording on page 15, line 27, is somewhat ambiguous in my opinion. Who would be allowed to record a voter receiving assistance at a voting station under this provision?
So the watcher could record that activity if they believe that the activity being observed is unlawful.
Thank you. Are poll watchers required to receive any training regarding how persons assisting voters with intellectual or developmental disabilities or traumatic brain injuries communicate with them?
Not currently, no, ma'am.
Not at all. Thank you. In your opinion, could the legislature amend this bill to prevent poll watchers from sending recordings of persons providing lawful assistance to a voter, to a law enforcement officer for investigation, which would you believe that would have a chilling effect on persons volunteering to provide assistance? Or do you think that's just business as usual?
I think that for persons who need assistance and an assistant is providing proper assistance, they would have nothing to be concerned about.
Thank you. Beginning on page 17, line 14, regarding personal information. This part of the bill requires persons assisting a voter at the polls to fill out a form that states the reason the assistance was necessary. Could this provision be interpreted as requiring the assistant to disclose confidential medical information regarding the voter in violation of the American with Disabilities Act?
No, I would tie it back to the, we're supposed to prescribe the form here, and so the form would be a generic reference to the reasons why someone would need assistance in the first place, and it would probably have a checkbox next to one of those reasons. So they're very generic and not voter specific.
Thank you. My next set of questions begins on, has to do with recording voters. And if you look at page 12, beginning on line 27, but then it skips to page 15, line 20, and that whole area. The bill would allow poll watchers to record video inside a polling place. What would prevent a poll watcher from recording a targeted population based on race or diversity or ethnicity?
So the only recordings they're supposed to make are when they believe someone is receiving unlawful assistance. That's in the polling place.
Is there any provision that would prohibit a poll watcher from uploading these videos to YouTube or to another online platform?
I'm not aware of a provision
No?
that would prohibit that.
Would the bill potentially subject election officials to criminal penalties if they try to stop a person from inappropriately harassing a voter by recording them?
Potentially, if that was determined by a prosecutor to be obstructing a poll watcher.
Thank you. Regarding the early voting hours limit that begins on page 19, line 6, would prohibiting early voting between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Do you think there's any evidence of increased instances of fraud at night?
Well, in Texas, we have very little experience with voting at night. This last election might be the only experience that we have with it.
What would be the rationale, or do you know of any rationale for prohibiting the voting? 24-hour voting, for example, is specifically what this is targeted.
Well, I mean, the difficulty with regard to having early voting poll workers work the entire early voting period is already difficult enough without requiring that they work all night.
Do you believe this prohibition would enhance election security?
I think that after a certain period, people get tired and are more likely to make mistakes. I don't know if that is necessarily related to security, but I think that if you want to keep people in their best frame of mind for doing the activity, then you need to limit the hours within which it's happening.
Or they could have different shifts, no?
Certainly.
Thank
If you've
you.
got enough people, that's the point about poll watchers are hard, or poll workers are hard enough to recruit.
I agree with you there, sir. Is there any evidence to suggest persons of a particular race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic class take advantage of late-night voting options?
Like I said, we don't have very much experience in Texas with late night voting. This last election was the first time that such a thing had been done.
Thank you. Regarding drive-through voting, beginning on page 15, lines 15 to 19, this bill would ban the use of drive-through voting. Do you know of any evidence that drive-through voting increases the likelihood of voter fraud?
No, but drive-through voting is currently not allowed in Texas.
But this ban would prohibit it.
It's already prohibited, but this would make it more explicit.
Is a total ban on drive-through voting necessary to address any concerns about the program, or are there less restrictive measures that would allow drive-through voting to occur securely?
Whether or not people are able to vote from their car outside of the context of curbside voting is a policy decision for the legislature.
and that's my question. Regarding the equal number of voting machines per county, beginning on page 14, lines 8 and to page 15, line 12, the bill would require counties to have an equal number of voting machines at each countywide polling place. How would this enhance election security?
I don't know that it's intended to enhance election security.
Would requiring the same number of voting machines at each countywide polling place restrict election officials' ability to direct resources to where they are most needed?
It definitely would constrain the flexibility of election administrators in the allocation of equipment.
Could this change increase wait times at polling places?
I mean, it's conceivable. It's conceivable that it could increase some and decrease it at others.
Thank you. Are there particular cities and counties where long lines at polling places are especially common, and do those areas tend to have more persons of color registered to vote?
In Texas, we have a pretty good track record with long lines. Generally, we have lines the first day of early voting and the last day of early voting, and not on Election Day. And so the lines that we have in Texas are because of voters' choices with regard to when they go to vote. And our office would encourage people to vote on a random Tuesday sometime in the middle of early voting.
Thank you, sir. Now, you're going to love this question. Is there any question you expected me to ask that I did not?
Certainly not. You've been thorough.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.